We're going to go ahead and get started with Daniel's presentation in just a couple of minutes. And the program says 2:30, but we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good.
Very rare, these things.
It's rare, too. So we'll have Steve come over and do the formal introduction. Steve?
Okay, well, many of you know our next speaker, Daniel Allen Jones. He's come all the way from Fort Worth to be with us today. He frequents the Valley. We've had him here before. He comes to a lot of the MUFON meetings. And we're grateful that he's here. Daniel, he is an investigative reporter for The Vortex, which is an online show that explores the mysteries of our world and beyond. He was a friend and close associate with the late great Texas author and paranormal investigator Jim Mars. Daniel is considered one of the top experts on the reported UFO crash of Aurora, Texas, which took place in 1897. So right now I'd like to welcome Daniel Jones.
Thanks, Stephen. All right, really appreciate the opportunity to be back here. This is the second time we've done this event. The library, McAllen Public Library, got together last year in January, I think it was, where we came out and they invited Noe, myself, and Stephen to talk about some interesting cases here in the Valley and beyond. And they said, do you think there'd be interest to do this again? And Noe let me know, and I thought, yeah, that's really awesome. So we recommended that we have Lillian Jimenez, who's the division coordinator for MUFON 956, who you guys just heard a moment ago speak, and I was really glad to be able to bring her on board and to help have a representative of the local MUFON group here, because one of the interesting things is that events like this bring together people from the area or wherever we are to be able to have these kinds of community engagement events, so we can look at this interesting phenomenon, and as well as be able to get together and discuss these issues. So I just wanted to, before we open up my presentation, pose the question to you guys. How many of you have had a sighting or an encounter or something you just haven't been able to explain or understand before? So now keep your hands up. How many of you have reported or documented or did something to make a record of that incident? Well, there we go. That's why we're here. So I think it's important to note that whether you're submitted a report to MUFON, you're calling the local sheriff's department, you're calling the news station, whatever you have to do, document your experience, because even if it turns out to be a drone, Starlink, or whatever else, it's not going to harm anything that you made an effort to document the experience. So I think what's helpful is that if not anything else, it turns out to be something anomalous or whatever else it could be to help us understand what's going on in and around our skies. That helps to kind of add a layer of corroboration and redundancy to our process of making an effort to try to clarify this strange and challenging issue of UFOs, ufology, right, which is the study of UFOs. And as Lillian brought up earlier, the close encounter scale is a big part about how we function in this field. We have to try to make sense of these cases that people submit, even well after the fact that they're submitted. And a lot of people are curious right now what's going on with the strange sightings, not just here around the border, but also all over the world with the mystery drone issue, what's going on in Congress, what's happening with the government, this idea of disclosure. There's a lot going on, and it's important that we can continue to have these gatherings to open up this discussion and invite people. So it's awesome to be able to have the library have a free event about this stuff and to be able to bring us all together so we can explore it. As Stephen had mentioned, I am interested in a wide variety of topics regarding unexplained phenomena and anomalous subjects. So when it comes to research about those things, most of my efforts with that gets poured into my media platform called The Vortex. But aside from that, I'm a musician by trade. I'm a private music instructor. So as he said, I came all the way from Fort Worth, and I'll be back there tomorrow doing lessons again. So I'm also interested in a number of other things like history, nature, anthropology, archaeology, those sort of things. And that kind of does tie into a lot of how I approach research. as I mentioned, the Vortex is where you can find video content that I've produced, interviews on location segments, presentations like this, and others from events, conferences. I am a fan. Here we are. They take us all over the galaxy to drop me off here for the weekend. I think this is from the first time knowing I actually met a whole decade ago over in Del Rio, Texas. That was another event they used to have out there. So one thing I will say is that it's important that we stay connected. If you're on Facebook or other social media, check out the Texas UFO Network, where people can submit reports that they want to, but it's not necessarily an investigative group. It's more of a networking hub or center for people to have resources and access to be able to share about things and find out what's going on. The subject matter of my talk today is going to be about Aurora, Texas, and the history of the legend from 1897. This has been referred to as the crash, as the alien, and its grave, a lot of different things. How many of you guys have heard of Aurora or its story before? Good, most of it. That's great. I'm going to probably show and describe a number of things which you might not know so much about, a little bit of the lesser-known history. What I've done is chronicled everything I can to show how this story is one of the most widely publicized instances of an otherworldly event ever. Probably next to Roswell and some of these other well-known instances, this has been something embedded in all kinds of multimedia, at least since the late 60s, every single year. And we're going to get into that as well. How many of you have actually been to Aurora, Texas? No, these guys have. That's awesome. Well, it's something that if you didn't know where you were going, you drive right through. It's a very small town. And as Stephen mentioned, our all good friend, the late great Jim Mars, happened to live not too far away. So that's how I got to know about it. And we would go out there and take a look at the locations of where this is supposed to all have taken place. And it's very small. Little town nested between Boyd and Rome, and we're just going to go through some information to kind of orient where that took place, where it is. And so here, of course, North America, South America, Central America, Texas. Of course, we're way down here, and so I'm situated up here in the Fort Worth area. It's about 7.5 hours away, and zooming in on the DFW Metroplex, one of the largest cities in the U.S., and there are DFW MUFON meetings. So DFW MUFON is kind of located in this area, but it's Texas. I should just say, because we're also including MUFON and all of this, is that Texas is one of the few states that needs multiple divisions of MUFON because of how large it is. Like California, you can't have one group get a call out to the Valley or something in West Texas when you're located wherever else. So we have to have different regions that people can go and be field investigators. So if you're interested in becoming a field investigator for MUFON or a member or just want to attend the meetings, the information is over here on the table, and it would be awesome to have you guys come out and see what that's all about. So, and if you've had the sighting, as you heard Lillian sharing about, you don't have to report it right away, although that's ideal. Some of those reports date back years. And some people just didn't know that there was a reporting agency or some kind of repository for reports like that. So it's something that is important to do at any time with whatever information you have. So getting a little bit closer, there's Aurora, northwest of the DFW area, about 20 miles, and it's a very small town. You drive right through it if you didn't know where you were going. This is a map of what it would have looked like in the 1890s. And most all of the multimedia you're going to see on here is either photographs or copies, things that I've taken myself to include, just to show the extent of all the different tangents of areas that you can go into when it comes to research. You can talk about a sighting of an object that someone saw up in the sky, which Lillian had talked about, the types of encounters, close encounter, first kinds, just seeing something. When you have something, an object that affects an area or people physically, that's the close encounters of the second kind. And so many of these types of things end up kind of blurring the lines and including several aspects, because a story like what we have from Aurora is not just the sighting of an object in the sky, not just that this object came and crashed, as we'll find out, but it also had what they call the pilot. So the close encounters of the third kind deals with, as Lillian said earlier, occupants. So this is considered a CE3 event. And we'll get into that in just a moment. A little bit of background about Aurora itself. So there's some challenges as to what went on in this town leading up to the story of this being published in the newspaper. It was one of the largest cities in Wise County, in which Aurora, Texas is situated. Thousands of people, but because of some challenges along the way, they lost a lot of people, and there was sort of a mass exodus, and they ended up becoming a ghost town of sorts. So they had got a post office, and then later on, a spotted fever, people began leaving, and they had plans for the railroad to come through town. That was changed, and unfortunately left them with a very challenging situation for years to come. But in 1897, one of the local cotton buyers and traders wrote an article called "A Windmill Demolishes It," and it appeared on the 5th page of the April 19th edition of the Dallas Morning News, which also included, here it is in the very middle, over a dozen other stories about what they called the airship. So how many of you guys have heard of the Great Airship Mystery before? Not very many. This is really good because, we talk about UFOs as if it's a modern phenomenon. And the challenge with that is that because of our cultural lenses of perception, we see different things throughout the years in different ways. And one of the interesting parts about what we call the Great Airship Mystery, or what the Dallas Morning News calls the Great Aerial Wanderer, is that people for several states over, but especially in Texas, were describing seeing the airship in 1896 and into 1897, especially in April. So this story is not isolated, but it stands out, I think, as one of the most, probably the most notable airship story, definitely the most popular and publicized. But all of these other stories describe people seeing something up there. They're not really described as the discs that we hear about, the flying saucers in the late 40s and into the 50s. And of course, now people are describing a lot, now that it's become a much more popular subject, the triangular shaped objects, as you hear, what Lillian brought up, and sometimes cigar-shaped. But in this era, a lot of times, this is something that people have wondered if there was something to the effect of inventors getting together and making these constructs that were like dirigibles or blimps, advanced air balloons, which were being made and were in production. And it's something that we have to put into perspective of the societal lens at the time, and to think about what were the things taking place that would have been the most likely explanation. Doesn't mean that's exactly what it was, but if you have no other frame of reference for anything, it's hard to put this Great Airship Mystery in perspective. So people apparently, if you get rid of 99% of all of these, if they were all tabloids or just written up as stories to bring in people, there's still such a highly concentrated number of reports in specific areas that were at this particular time, it makes it probably difficult to think that they were all fake. And that's probably one of the challenges we face now, is that, when in this subject we have people who do, unfortunately, fabricate reports. There are a good number of genuine anomalous things that people do report. So it's difficult to discern some of these, but this story stands out, I think, the most. A windmill demolishes it. Here is the author, Samuel Edwin Hayden, probably the only photo in existence of this man sitting on some bales of hay. He was a cotton buyer and trader. He's often described as a stringer for the paper. But the reality is that in the years of research that I've tried to dig into this, I've never found another article or even anything remotely similar to this that this person wrote, or that has been attributed to Hayden. His name is often misspelled. A lot of authors mix the names up, and that provides challenges for research when you're doing historical research to try to find names of people, and we'll see how that comes just a moment. So here's the article. As you can see, it's not very long. What we're going to do is go through and break it down just so everyone can get a good idea. It's a windmill demolishes it. Aurora, Wise County, Texas, April the 17th, to the news. So just for some reference here, this was published on the 19th, but describes events taking place 2 days earlier on the 17th. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship, which has been sailing through the country. So they describe it singularly as the airship. It was traveling due north and much nearer the earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the earth. It sailed directly over the public square, and when it's reached the north part of town, collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, And while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Well, folks, we did something incredible. We dug him up and we brought him out just for this weekend. He's over there on the table. Go have a look. Mr. T.J. Weems, the United States Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on his person, evidently the record of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. The ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver. It must have weighed several tons. The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal. From the debris, the pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow. Signed, Samuel Edwin Hayden, S.E. Hayden. So, it's really interesting to consider the many aspects of this report. Again, it's not just a sighting, like many of the other airship reports describe, seeing something up in the air, maybe with propellers or wings, sometimes a crew, and sometimes hearing them sing, or sometimes seeing something like an anchor being dropped down. And so these are all interesting qualities, but this one actually was reported to have crashed, and the pilot thereof was recovered and then given a funeral. Now, that there are some other interesting aspects that we've heard about, like this was also repeated in what was called the Fort Worth Register, a now defunct newspaper that describes the same report, but says that the pilot was given a burial with Christian rites. And that has been repeated, at least by a number of researchers, including Jim Mars. But I haven't, and we've talked about this, Noah and I, we can't find any trace of that article from the Fort Worth Register that has that repeated story. It would be great if it does exist. I'm not so sure it does, but it's just one of those things that, it's like the telephone game. If someone says something and attributes it to a case or in any situation, a lot of times that gets repeated. And this is one of those instances where, well, it says that the pilot was given a funeral, so we can infer that perhaps because it's a funeral, that it was a Christian burial. And, you know, that might not be historically accurate. It might be. But we do know that that was a Masonic cemetery, and that you can't be interned unless you're a Mason within, you know, certain Masonic grounds. And so that there are a lot of historical challenges with the story, even in the technical sense. It's already a fantastic story, no matter what. But even in some of those different areas that we can dive in, there are some sides of this that we can try to find out some of the details, and that's the part that I think is interesting to follow up on, is have there been any repeated articles or subsequent follow-ups since this? And the answer I'm finding is it doesn't seem to be the case for many, many, many years, unless people talked about it in town and word of mouth got around. And so there are some different things that we can presume, but I like to try to work with what we can document and track down factually. So what I've done is put together a chronology of events. One thing that is helpful to put in perspective is, as many of you know, the Wright brothers put together the flyer out of Kitty Hawk in 1903, 6 years after the fact. Some other things, War of the Worlds by Wells basically describes a Martian invasion, which came out a year later. So the idea that science fiction wasn't around is not really all that accurate. It was, and even the story itself suggests that people could come up with the idea. Even if this was all a hoax and fake, people at least knew enough about these ideas of otherworldly people to be imaginative enough to, like, you know, this book coming out, have an influence on society and our thinking at the time. And I also just want to throw in, because doing this research, you come across a lot of other interesting tropes and ideas. So you guys have probably all heard of the trope Little Green Men. It's often attributed to the idea of space people, or like, well, you have one over here, Xeno. So the earliest record I can find of it being used in reference to otherworldly inhabitants is from 1906. And before that, it almost is always in reference to the Fae lore, the Fae folk or fairy and Celtic lore. So it's interesting to see how that kind of ties in, because it's a shift in perspective, a shift in cultural perspective when its use becomes assimilated into our, you know, forward innovative thinking of the space age. And so, of course, we wouldn't know to use this that way until many decades, like half a century later. So just some things for historical reference. One thing I should mention is that it's been interesting looking at some historical documentation, which has otherwise nothing to do with UFOs or aliens, to see if there's any mentioning of any type of wreckage or whatever we can that at least lists people, names, dates, situations, places, all of that. This is one of the earliest, maybe the primary source of history of Wise County, the Pioneer History of Wise County by Cliff Cates, and it's from 1907. This book is an original who I was shown by the Coleman family, who are residents there in Aurora, Texas. I was fortunate to be able to talk with them and interview them, and they showed me that they actually did have a copy of this. It does not mention the story or the legend whatsoever, so it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, although you would think that if a story of this nature is notable enough that it would have been included in as many things as it could. One thing I would say, though, is that Leon Coleman here doesn't say that he thinks it didn't happen. He just says that he didn't think it was a spaceship. He was actually pretty open in his enthusiasm that he didn't think that it could have been a spaceship because, as he described, his grandfather was there watering his horses at the local well and happened to talk to the people there at the time who described that it was a 2-motor gasoline-powered engine plane that had crashed. And so I asked him, wouldn't that have been pretty interesting to know about before the Wright brothers? And he responded saying that he didn't think it was before the Wright brothers. So there are some inconsistencies in his recollection of this. But it just goes to show that there are people who try to keep track of what the reality of this situation really is. Moving forward, this is really interesting. So how many of you guys have heard of Charles Fort, or Fortean phenomenon? So a lot of what we discuss when it comes to UFOs and other weird topics have often been attributed to Charles Fort, who looked into a lot of interesting things way before UFO, the UFO phenomenon was like a collective field of study. In 1919, he wrote a book called Book of the Damned, and it was one of the first UFO books, probably the first UFO book ever. But a few years later, in 1923, he wrote a book called New Lands, which he includes a really interesting statement. He was one of the first researchers who looked into those original airship reports just a few decades after it happened. He says, against such an alliance as this, he's talking about the people at the time who were saying that these airships were nothing more than craft built by inventors. They're suggesting him and his collective group, which would later become known as the Fortean organization, basically were considering, could there be something more, something other than human behind some of these strange incidents, not just airships, but a lot. And he says, against such an alliance as this, between the jokers and the astronomers, I see small chance for our data. In other words, suggesting that maybe there could be something otherworldly. The chances in the future, if in April 1897, extra-mundane voyagers did visit this Earth, likely enough, they will visit again, and the alliance against the data may be guarded against. So he's suggesting that if there are visitors from something somewhere else, wherever, however, that it might not be easy to show, to prove at this point, but maybe many years later, like now, it would be much easier to have an open discussion and consideration for it. In 1923, this is pretty innovative, well before its time, so hats off to Charles Fort for openly talking about this issue. He doesn't name Aurora directly, but to suggest what he calls extra-mundane voyagers, when in most all of the airship reports, they never describe, there's very few reports that describe something like Aurora as far as an otherworldly visitor. So I wonder if he ever really did get his hands on an original Dallas Morning News paper. That would have been the only way he would have known about something like this other than sharing it with other people. Pretty interesting. The person who was described as an authority on astronomy who attributed the pilot to being a native of the planet Mars, Thomas Jefferson Weems, is buried not too far from Aurora, and he passed away in 1925. So he would have lived on at some point to, the extent if anyone ever did come to town to require, further information, if it was such a big deal, you'd think that there would be a lot of follow-up. And so we don't know if there's really much of a record of people coming, this idea to bring in tourism as a more modern concept, but we don't know if that really took place. But he would have lived a long enough time that maybe have seen it if anything did. What I will mention is that Aurora itself really didn't prosper again until at least in the 40s, because in 39, Texas Highway 114 finally went all the way through and helped to bring them traffic again. So otherwise they remained somewhat of a ghost town for decades. Very difficult for the locals there. And here, where this was supposed to have happened on those the Proctor's property, eventually new families became interested in the land. They wanted to move onto the property and use the facilities, and so there was a well which was apparently connected to that water tank and windmill that they wanted to clean out and use. So the Oates family, which had been residents there in Wise County for a number of years, moved over and started to clean out the property, and in 1946, I'm told by the family, they were actively living there. In 1950, a report, I was able to find an original report by a man named Foss, Harold Foss, that describes interviewing with residents there in Aurora, not about the spaceship or spaceman or anything like that, but just about regular town things, which seems pretty normal. The closest reference I can find to anything that makes this relatable is he asks if anyone remembers there being an Aurora newspaper. If this author would have been a stringer for anything, you'd think that he would have probably had something published locally, and that if they had an Aurora newspaper, he would have been a regular contributor or columnist or something to that effect. Some people describe there being no knowledge of a newspaper, and then some people say yes, there was an Aurora Lights or Aurora Chronicle or Aurora newspaper. So there was an Aurora newspaper, and even this man, Charlie Stevens, was someone who got interviewed. We'll find out a little bit more about him later on, but Jim Mars, many years later, actually interviewed Charlie Stevens, who claimed to have been only a child at the time, but a witness to the incident and to the airship itself. Although he didn't include it in this report, he told Jim later on. After about 12 years, that Oates family sealed up that well because they did not like how it was going. They had some concerns that it was leaching alloy and into the water, and unfortunately they felt like they became somewhat ill. You can see on the seal it says Oates 1957. Into the 60s, this is, I think, a turning point for this story, because before this time, it doesn't seem that I haven't been able to come across any reference at all, or any kind of memorabilia or any literature that references the story of a crash or a pilot before 1966. Into the 60s, this is something that really is where this picks up and gets back into public awareness. I would be thrilled to find something that even talks about this. There are tons of handwritten notes and everything, but in '66, writers for the Houston Chronicle and other publications like the Dallas Morning News became aware by people submitting stories to look back into the old-timers tales and urban tales and things like this to talk about in their newspapers. So they caught wind of this, and then suddenly in '66 it became, it was just all over the headlines in these newspapers. And specifically got enough attention to bring someone out from England to come and write a report and investigate for the Flying Saucer Review. And in other publications, it actually brought out a scientist from the Kilgore Institute to do some preliminary investigative work, some field research. It's really important to see that, even back in the 60s. And this is, of course, like Project Blue Book had been going on at this point for a while, so investigating UFOs was a thing at this time. But in the sense as we can look at it now, much of the equipment probably used was, in our outlook, very primitive at the time. But people were finding things and finding kind of mundane pieces of metal and farm materials. But in the 70s, it got a lot of notoriety. A lot has happened since then, but in the 70s, this is probably where it really culminated. It became national headlines. It's something that appeared in almost every mainstream major states newspaper, because the publications of the United Press International and Associated Press, this became widespread national news. It's really interesting to see, and thanks to our good friend Jim Mars, who was on location at the time, he went out and talked with those people, like I mentioned, Charlie Stevens and others, to see what was going on, because people were descending upon Aurora to figure out what the story really was about, and if there's anything that could be done to investigate it. So he was a writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and wrote articles about the ongoing investigation. You can see some of the fun cartoons that were being put out at the time as well. And you can see it's just one of those things that people kind of like to joke about because they know that this sort of story catches attention. there's Jim writing about this and showing people in the grave and at the crash site location to the effect that, you know, they could try to figure out where things would have been, where they would have been taking place after so many years already, almost a century later at this point. Dr. Tom Gray was a physicist at the North Texas State University, now UNT, was doing his own investigations, analyzing some of the pieces of metal, which he described had strange properties. Some of them, most of them seemed to be like normal metal, but some of them had high concentrations of zinc and aluminum, which was later described to be very difficult to have been made available before 1933. Aluminum did exist, but it wasn't available in large quantities, more widely accessible. And to use something like aluminum back then would have been very costly and would not make sense to be used in this kind of way for a little payoff, basically. Even if it was all a prank and all of this, like it would have cost them more to get the aluminum and everything to do that than they ever made back in any kind of sense of the thought. But other people like aviation writer Bill Case wrote for the now defunct Dallas Times-Herald, was also investigating on behalf of MUFON, even back then. So MUFON came about in 1969, and even in its first few years of infancy, Aurora was one of its major cases. And so at the time, Bill Case would be investigating and corresponding with Walt Andrus and John Schuessler, big MUFON players at the time. John Schuessler is still around. And they put together an enormous 200-page report about what they discovered, and they basically concluded that something of high heat, an immense heat, caused an explosion and charred remains and embedded molten alloy into the ground and into the nearby trees. They are almost certain that something did happen. But they don't automatically say there was alien, because they don't know if they could prove that, but there is something to what they think caused this high heat burnt material. Hayden Hughes was from Oklahoma and with a group called the International UFO Bureau. He came down and tried to do a similar investigation with his group, and they brought people out during 1973 and even got to the point of attempting to find legal ways to exhume the supposed grave site that they were pretty sure belonged to this spaceman, as they called him. So that's one of the big questions that I always get asked is why don't they just dig them up and settle this all, once and for all? Well, they tried to half a century ago now. And the Cemetery Association basically threatened with an injunction saying, if anyone comes digging, we will put a lawsuit and end this. The Oates family ended up kind of realizing there's a lot of conjecture with all of this, and Raleigh Oates, who was the man there who lived there using that well, came out later and said, we've used that well, we stopped because they think that it gave them some kind of health condition. And he has really bad arthritis on his hands, which you can see in this picture, which he and his wife Bonnie Oates said that they thought it was because of that well water potentially being radiated, which they could find in Jim Mars and other people. So it's a very interesting twist to this story. I don't think there's any medical records to substantiate this claims. That would be incredible, but it's just we're left with pictures and testimony. So, it's hard to discern what really made this happen, but it is kind of strange when you see people who do seem to be affected by being in close proximity to UFO events have things happen or describe some kind of radiation. This is the alleged original stone. Some people say it had been there, like the MUFON reports. It's supposed to have been there the whole time. And then some people say this was added a little bit later. So there's contending viewpoints about this small rock. You can see it's not exactly a nice polished marble gravestone. It's like a hand-hewn little crude stone. And some people suggest, like Jim Mars did, that it looks like it was half of a stone, of a more full stone that an etching would have shown the other half to a flying saucer or something like that. And very creative, I'll give him that. I don't know, but it just seems like something was etched on here at some point. Very curious. This is important to note because, as I mentioned, Bill Case with MUFON, this is from a huge report, and it's just a part of it. It says, this is a media report on the investigation. MUFON and the Times-Herald, which he was the writer for, were looking to locate the grave first, and the headstone, they found the designs, and they used metal detecting to describe what was underground, and which they found readings, and they sent that to John Schuessler, who had all of the metal examined. And there's that report I mentioned has a whole analysis on that. And this is an important statement here at the end. There's no question a crash occurred. There's no question a mystery grave has been in the Aurora Cemetery since the incident, and evidence links them together. Pretty strong statement. Although that has been contended, there are some strong opinions about this whole situation. I will say, though, enough of this, basically the commotion and everything that was happening got the attention of the Historical Society there in Wise County, enough so that Rosalie Gregg, the main person of the Historical Society, put together a manuscript which included a number of the town's history points, as well as something that got included with the Texas Historical Commission approving for a historical marker there to be put in the Aurora Cemetery. It does include that this site is also well known because of the legend that a spaceship crashed nearby in 1897. The pilot killed in the crash is buried here. So it's officially recognized as a legend by the Texas Historical Commission. This is probably one of the only markers in the world that says something like this, and it's still there today. Into the 80s, this is kind of a fun time frame, most notably because of the movie, the campy B, almost maybe C film that came out called Aurora Encounter. And I think I found out about this because of Noe and Steven, I think, presenting it at one of these events years ago that talks about how they kind of rode the coattails of E.T. as a nice, friendly alien movie, so it's not like an invading, evil alien invader. But what is cool, I will mention, I did bring some memorabilia. That is one of the original theatrical release movie posters over there, and I've come across some really interesting media prints that are one of a kind, a little film, 35 millimeters. Very low budget movie. It wasn't made in Aurora, but it was made here in Texas. So this is kind of a fun aspect to being able to take it onto the big screen and bring it to life in a fun and very creative way. They obviously had some creative licensing to go a little different route from the story, and he doesn't crash and die immediately. And I'll just... who's seen this movie, by the way? Has anyone actually seen this movie? Cool. I would just highly recommend. It's like on Tubi for free. I think you can watch it all on YouTube. I've got some original physical copies of it on VHS and beta, which is fun. But there's the movie poster. One thing I will say is really neat. So the artist who made this poster artwork, I guess the highlight of his career would have been making the art for Star Wars Return of the Jedi, to only go a few years later to make art for Aurora Encounter, because it's one way to have an art career. And so many newspapers would go around and pretty much bashing the whole movie. Some would say it's harmful and it's okay. And then Aurora's no close encounter of any kind. So, it just kind of gave their slant on what they thought about the movie. It's fun, I guess. So yeah, it's one of those things that depending on how they enjoyed it or not, they would have wrote about that. Even the MUFON Journal included it in a segment called UFOs in Real Life. Very clever. So it's fun to see, and of course, pretty much everyone bashes the movie because it was just such a low budget thing. What I will say though, and I think this is kind of interesting to note, is that the boy who played the alien or the spaceman in the movie had progeria, and it was part of the Make-A-Wish Foundation that he wanted to be in a movie. So it's not like this cruel stunt. They were like, let's make him, he looks weird, let's make him be the alien. He wanted to. And that was cool because he only passed away and lived for a few years after that. And his name was Mickey Hayes. And I didn't know this at the time I acquired this, but that theatrical poster over there is actually signed by him. And the person who I got it from didn't know that. They just thought I had to write on it or something. So it's cool that he signs, probably one of the only things that he got to sign. I don't know, but it's cool. And I found his grave out in Tyler, Texas, where he's from. So thanks, Mickey. And yeah, go check out Aurora Encounter. So into the 90s, there's a few other interesting things that have happened. It gets into a much more modern time frame with the internet, with television becoming a huge wave that information gets digested by the public. MUFON launched a new investigation to commemorate the 100th anniversary, and they put together a team and went out there as well. Jim wrote his book, Alien Agenda, which is what really kind of set him off in the UFO world. He had been writing, as you might have remembered earlier on, for years, but he made his first break as an author writing about the Kennedy assassination with his book Crossfire, and he said this a number of times openly, but he would tell me personally, after he did that, he really caught his break as an author, and he's like, now, and he did like that. He was a huge history buff and Kennedy buff, but after he wrote that book and it did well enough for him to continue as an author, he would say, now I can write about stuff I really like aliens and UFOs. So he wrote this book, Alien Agenda, which at the time was one of the best-selling think the best-selling nonfiction book on UFOs ever, and it's still up there. You can find copies out in the world, but it's really cool that he wrote this and he included it. Now I will say that what's fun is that, and I'll mention this here in a moment, he, into the 2000s, was a continuing education professor at the University of Texas in Arlington. And he taught 2 courses, one on the Kennedy assassination and one on UFOs. For the UFO class, he actually used his book, Alien Agenda, as the textbook. And because it was included, all the students would have gone over that case, and he actually took them out on field trips to the location in the early 2000s. And I've talked to people who were actually part of the class and got to tell them about that. It's really cool. So in the 2000s, there was some locals there in Aurora who got together, and it's a very small town, remember, so there's not really any commerce or industry, very little going on there. There's some residential zonings and things like that. Well, the Dirty family put together this business concept called Area 114. As you remember, the Highway 114 would go through town. So they opened up a little novelty shop and basically decided to sell mugs, hats, and little goodies and start a website, AuroraAlien.com. For the first time, it's landed online and it's been able to be made accessible to people all around the world. And people can come and get a novelty item as well. At the time, Jim had been working on a documentary and finally produced it in 2002, which he called Aurora, the UFO Crash of 1897. And so once he finished it all and got it all wrapped up and made some VHSs and a few DVDs, it's always interesting how this works, and I know that you guys can attest to this as well. Whenever you publish something, it's always going to be interesting to know how things are, how feedback works and how people follow up, because people say, you know what, I had something happen too. And of course that happened to Jim, like this man here who showed him pieces of metal that he described he was given as trinkets. After he made this documentary that, featured Aurora and all this stuff, people after the fact say, yeah, I watched that, and you know what, I have this, and I'm going to tell you about it. So it's just one of those things, it goes with this kind of arena. When you come up with something, there's always someone who's going to come after that and tell you that they have something else to add. So a few years later, and I will just mention before this happened, and it's cool, who was here in 2018 at the Edinburgh UFO Festival and Conference? Did anyone get to go to the 2018 version year? So why I bring up 2018 is because we had John Greenwald from the Black Vault. And that was also just a few months after the big New York Times release about ATIP and all that. Well, why I mentioned that with John Greenwald is because the History Channel contacted him to put together a documentary in 2005 about Aurora. And I didn't have to slide on this one, but they got to do it. It was his first ever documentary that he ever did. He's known for a project called the Black Vault for submitting Freedom of Information Act requests for FOIAs to inquire about UFOs and other related topics. You can go to the Black Vault with John Greenwald to check all of that out. But he did this documentary about Aurora in 2005 on the History Channel. They did not gain access to the well and the supposed crash site in a way that they wanted. So a few years later, their new show called The UFO Hunters got permission to go on site, thanks to my buddy Ken Cherry, who I worked with a number of years. Ken Cherry was the state director here in Texas for MUFON for years. And he helped the UFO Hunters show get access to the site there with the family. So they got, and Jim got to talk and be on the show as well. They sent a man named Pat Usker down the well. They unsealed that well. They sent him down there to see if there was anything to recover. And unfortunately, while they didn't find any metal, they did some water testing, and they couldn't really find much going on with the water. But what it is really important about this is the first time, probably the main way that this took place is that on the other side of town, which isn't really very far away, they got to do ground penetrating radar, or GPR, over the grave site after trying to figure out where exactly they were able to determine the site was. And they described a small child-sized coffin or grave underground, and they weren't able to determine the contents. They weren't able to figure out what exactly was in there. It was indiscernible, but they could find that there was some kind of small, what they described as a child-sized grave in the location. The 2010s, this is an interesting time frame. How many of you guys have seen this picture over here on the left? It's often described and shown to be in relation to the story, because it is related, but it's often misrepresented as the original headstone. This was put into place by, I think, a local author or artist or sculptor in 2012. And I'll get into some of these more books. You can see some of Noe's books and things up here as well. Jim Mars and myself, and his assistant Aretha, we went up to the city of Aurora in 2015 to pitch the idea to host a commemorative event about the legend and about Aurora's history. And at the time, Dr. Tony Wheeler, who was the city administrator, was all for it. She embraced the theme. Here she is with who they affectionately called Ned. So if you've ever heard Ned in relation to this story here in Aurora, Texas, it's directly due to Tony Wheeler, who growing up in Aurora at the time as a little girl was told the story by one of the old-timers whose name was Ned, which is why she called her little mascot Ned. And they embraced the theme. They utilized the imagery to be able to put on their city materials and just pretty much rebranded with a new stylized city logo. An iconic windmill and spaceship, flying saucer type disc shape are a little bit more recognizable than perhaps a windless derrick tower or a cigar-shaped UFO airship, right? So this is a lot more easy to kind of look at and be curious about. And they put a big stone where the other great stone had been. One thing I did mention earlier, I should really quick. Back when there was an attempt at legally exhuming the gravesite, that little headstone went missing after there was a cemetery watch. And the metal apparently that was being detected was also missing, so there was some like drill holes. So there apparently hadn't been really anything there for a number of years. I will go back and just say though that this stone was put in place in 2012 and then went missing a year later. So things keep getting stolen. They thought that maybe a big stone like this would be a little bit harder to take off with, and it is, or was very big. It just wasn't really put in the exact place that they needed to. I went out there a number of times with Jim. He would take me to both the crash site and grave sites. We talk at length about the history and our planning for our event, which we held soon after that. He got to be on Fox News, which is a great way to let people know about some of the interesting Texas history. They had a show with Richard Ray called The Tex Files, which was kind of fun. In April of 2016, we held the first ever, and more than likely only ever, Aurora Alien Encounter. Really cool, sold out event. Jim was there to kick things off. Here we are, my friends and colleagues, Noe Torres and Stephen Androsco, and Travis Walton was the keynote speaker. You might remember him from the movie and story of his experience, Fire in the Sky. And then this is Daniel, I think, as well. So he was there and got to take part. And so this is at the site. And it was just really great to have everyone there. And Ned, there he is in the local newspaper, so that was really cool. And they were so excited about the interest that they tried to really pick up and take off with the traction they now had. They did a haunted house, which is really cool. And then we had slated plans for the following year. And unfortunately, there were some logistical challenges, and unfortunately, Jim Mars passed away. So the event was canceled and indefinitely postponed. That's an unfortunate situation overall, but not nearly as messed up as what was to come later on. One of the cool things, though, is because of the interest and the success, they were able to erect this monument. Ned is not a permanent attachment. He just got, a little photo op. But you've got the stylized city logo as the spaceship crashing into a windmill. So it's really cool how they got to have this. It's still there. The following year, I got to work with the Messenger, the Wise County newspaper there, Wise County Messenger, to do some tours, and we had a great turnout. A lot of people there. And a Dallas attorney actually offered a reward for the whereabouts of the original headstone. And I think he put it up to Noe did an event that I got to go to in Allen, Texas. Not McAllen, but Allen, Texas, up closer to where I am, north of Dallas. And Stratton Horace was one of the speakers there. And when I asked him about that, at this time, he was only offering about $2,500 reward. When I saw him there, he said it's up to $10,000. And I've had a few people tell me they know where that original headstone is. They haven't told me directly where it is, but that they know. And so I'd like to maybe connect those dots and see if we can find out what's going on with that. Carrie Haggard wrote a fictional story called Traveler based upon the story. There are a lot of books that are solely based about Aurora and its legend, but some are kind of the main focus, and so Carrie came up with one. In 2019, I started to take Ned around. I got him a wheelchair because it was only, he's in a bad bracket. So there we are. I got him buttons and pins. We had a great time going on tour. A lot of fun. Went to Alien Con, Contact in the Desert. You guys probably know him. Giorgio Tsoukalos. He's been to Edinburgh before, and he's been to the International UFO Congress. We went and saw the Marfa Lights. We went to Extraterrestrial Highway, saw Area 51. He's been to Roswell, of course. And in 2020, Aurora started to kind of attempt some developments, and they got a new City Hall sign, which is, I guess, made to look like that old stone. Pretty cool. And they brought back that idea of Area 114, but they wanted to turn it into not just a small little shed, basically, but like a big, what they call a party patio. And the idea was awesome. You could see the sort of stylized logo and everything. They had tables, a patio covering, a stage for live music. They had Martian margaritas, which some of you have already seen. Those stickers over there, you're welcome to grab some. Awesome theme. Ned got his own beer, Alien L, which you can grab some stickers. Very fun. There was also smoking windmill barbecue, which, the theme of the windmill and all of that. In 2021, I was asked by Spectrum News to do a news report on the then upcoming UAP task force report about what's happening, and a lot has obviously changed since 2021, but they asked if I knew anywhere that might be suitable to hold a news report about this, and I said, I think I know a place, and so we got to go do it in Aurora, which is pretty cool. You can see this, you can just type in Aurora, Texas, Spectrum News, and find this on YouTube. Soon after that, like a few weeks after that news report, something really weird and unfortunate happens. The City Hall mysteriously burns down, and the place where we used to go and hold those meetings to try to work out our plans for the event turns into this. Basically nothing but cement walls and the floor, no roof. And it's really wild because not long after that, this news report started popping up, and it turns out that Tony Wheeler, the city administrator, was basically stealing a lot of money from the townsfolk there, probably over a number of years, and is now going to be behind bars for a long time. So now I don't think they could pin her for arson, but it just happened to be very convenient that all the records for the money that was missing got burnt up in the City Hall, and so that's really too bad. Embracing the theme and imagery of a fun story is cool, but stealing like what I've heard is upward of like $2+ million from your local townsfolk. That's not cool. So, Smoking Windmill Barbecue unfortunately had to move down the road. They had a new cool mural that they put together, which that's fun. Had a nice location. They had some live music every once in a while. So a very cool place. I do a regular anniversary update and go out on location. The Roswell Museum. How many of you guys have been to the Roswell Museum before? I know Noah used to help put together the festival. It's cool. They have a great display. They updated it not too long ago, and they do have a situation that describes it here with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This is just one of them, but they do have that little stone that is not the original. And I told them, I said, I have a picture of what the original stone was supposed to be, and so I'm going to bring that there this summer because they're going to have their festival 4th of July weekend like every year, and we're going to go check that out. So they can update it with what looks like the original stone, and so it's cool that even in Roswell. I also put together this fun little project, so I mentioned earlier, I like to call him Jimmy Mars. We don't have Ned, which by the way was probably in City Hall when it burnt down, so it's been 2 fire tragedies now. And I thought, he was named Ned because Tony was a little girl talking with the old timer named Ned. The guy who really helped to shed light on this for me was Jim. So I just thought it'd be fun to call him Jimmy Mars, because they say he was from Mars, and it's just a great way to kind of have a display, so you guys can go check him out over there. There's his papers, his parts of his ship, and he's in this little coffin. There's the flowers that he destroyed. And since that whole situation, the whole unfortunate circumstance with the city shouldn't overshadow its history, although it does leave a mark. We can't deny it. We shouldn't just ignore that it is part of its history now. I approached the City Hall and City Council a number of times to see where they stand with it, and unfortunately they just really wanted to disassociate with Tony Not necessarily the story, but because of her involvement, they really wanted to kind of not really have hands-on with a lot of that stuff anymore. So they're doing better. They have had a few updates, and they've made progress, and I'll show that in a minute. So because of the loss of the City Hall and the records that they kept, I had to find other avenues of research. So I went to the local county museum, Wise County Heritage Museum, which had a huge wealth of collections of knowledge and things, pioneer history. They did have a section of Aurora material, which was included in this box. Original newspapers, correspondence letters, things like that. Some pretty cool stuff. Not an entire shelf of all this stuff, but literally just this. A lot of files and documents though. I helped them by photocopying literally everything in this box, which I'm very glad because unfortunately a few months later, the museum burns down. Now I don't think it was arson. I don't think that it was anything like an intentional. I don't know, but it's just this story now has a weird intertwining of unfortunate fiery tragedies that seem to make us. So even when we try to do what we can to preserve history, we can't always guarantee that it'll be there. But I'm glad that I got to photocopy all of that Aurora material because I'm in the process of helping them archive that digitally because they are also now, the Historical Commission is trying to recuperate, of course. One of the things I did 2 years ago was try to recreate this photo and try to see exactly where that stone was. And I think we're pretty close. I mean, we've always known that this wasn't really in the exact location, but you can see it's within 5 to 10 feet. But you can see that's very close. It's kind of cool to think that, that's this historic place, even in the last half century, that people have been trying to understand this whole story. I wrote an article for the Roswell Daily Record newspaper, of which the famous or maybe infamous story about the weather balloon, the crashed disc that was seen on Brazos Ranch that made its way. You guys have probably seen that picture of the guys holding up tin foil, what looks like that. That was taken in Fort Worth, Texas, because they brought the debris from the Roswell wreck situation to Fort Worth and then later on to Dayton, Ohio with Wright Patterson. And so what's interesting is that you have situations where even 50 years apart, you have stories of crashed vehicles with material, debris, bodies. And so I just included this in this article. I didn't use the word UFO, I think, once, because it wasn't supposed to be about UFOs, but at the time there was a lot of interesting things going on. I interviewed 2 scientists for this article, Dr. Avi Loeb, who's now really involved with the subject in some way with Harvard, and then also Dr. Seth Shostak of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I asked them both, if it came to be that we find out that, as we've heard now in Congress a few times, that these so-called whistleblowers who are saying that we have non-human technology, non-human materials, and non-human bodies or biologics, things like that. If it turns out that this is all true, I asked them, would you be willing to offer and utilize your services and resources to help? And they were like, if there's anything to these claims, then absolutely. But until then, they're just stories. So, we have to do what we can to pay attention, but also see what substance can be utilized from these claims. I hosted the Roswell Incident event there in Roswell 2 years ago where I talked about these same histories of Aurora, and one of the guests that we had virtually was Tim Burchett. Now, not to really make this political at all or anything, but what was interesting about having him there, and this was unsolicited and unprovoked, but he had said that we've known about this topic of UFOs for years and years, and it goes back into the 1800s, and he named Aurora, Texas. And so it was cool to see that Congressman here, Tim Burchett, already knew about the Aurora story. And I wasn't prompting with anything, so I was able to talk with him for a bit about that. And as I mentioned, new developments in Aurora. They did get a new City Hall ribbon cutting event, but as you can see, they took off the spaceship from the logo. That was something that they decided sort of off the radar to try to see how it looked, I was told. At that event, I met with Bill Oates, who's the son of Raleigh Oates, the man who drank from the well. He says that as a kid, moving there, that they all drank from the well about the same number of years. However, he feels and thinks that even though he drank from the same well for the same amount of time, that he doesn't seem to have as nearly as drastic of an effect that his father did, but that it could be that there's some things that happened to him health-wise as well. But there's Billy Oates. He still lives there in Aurora, not at the same location, but still in town. In 2024, this is the location of that stone. Then, on the anniversary, strangely enough, they removed, I would say on official business, the Aurora Cemetery Association moved that big stone and put into place these rectangular blocks to, I think, mark previously unmarked plots. It's probably the site has been disturbed in a long time, so it's interesting that happened sort of without announcement or anything. At the same time, I launched a website, auroralegend.com, to serve as an encyclopedia database for all of this information, which you can go on, and I'm still in the process. It's a work in progress, but I'm still doing what I can to update it. I was very honored last year to be included on a project panel at the MUFON Symposium, thanks to Earl Gray, who unfortunately just passed away. So shout out to Earl Gray Anderson, rest in peace, my good friend. He invited me, along with Chanel Shands and Geraldine Stith, to talk about some historical cases and what he called the next generation. Why I think it's important, I was a bit of an outsider coming in to be a part of this panel, but he wanted to include me because as a longtime UFO investigator and someone of interest with MUFON, he recognized the importance of Aurora and its story and the UFO lore and how deep-seated it is for this subject. Not just Aurora, but Chanel is the granddaughter of Kenneth Arnold. So to have her there, Kenneth Arnold is the one who said he saw 9 crescent-shaped objects over Mount Rainier in Washington in 1947. July 24th, 1947 became this day. Now in July 24th we call it like World UFO Day, because that's when he saw these objects, and then later went on to say this to the media, which repeated it as him having seen flying saucers, which he did not say he saw flying saucers. He saw them move as if they had a saucer-like motion, and that he actually described them as being crescent-shaped objects, 9 of them. And so, the media spins this out into saying flying saucers, and now we get this term that we use even these days about, the inference of aliens and spaceships as flying saucers. So Kenneth Arnold's granddaughter, Chanel Shands, was there, which is awesome. And how many of you guys have heard of the Hopkinsville Goblins case? So not enough then. So this is really cool. Okay, the idea is cool. The story's kind of weird and maybe traumatic. But in 1955, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, in Kelly, Kentucky, this family out on their property saw these weird, glowing, translucent, goblin-type little green men, as they called them, hovering around on top of their house, out on the trees, and some of them tried to shoot at them to no avail, and they were just kind of floating down and scared them very traumatically. And Geraldine is a family member who's now gone on to share that legacy. It was become known as one of the most interesting UFO stories of the Hopkinsville Goblins case of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, 1955. So anyway, I was very fortunate to be on this panel to talk about, on the behalf of learning so much from Jim, rest in peace, and rest in peace Earl, to be able to include a lot of the history of Aurora to the MUFON Symposium there, which is also happening. The MUFON Symposium will be in July for anyone interested. Just a few other updates as I wrap this part up. Basically, throughout last year, I was fortunate to go to a number of places to follow up the research. No more City Hall, no more Wise County Museum, so where else to go? But pretty much everywhere else I can. I went to the UTA Special Collections Archive. They were very, very helpful. I'm not a student, I'm not a member or anything like that, and even in that capacity, the head archivist was like enthusiastic that someone wanted to come down into the basement and check out the microfilms, of which they had an original a microfilm copy of the original article. So I was able to scan that and get some like high resolution photos of the original article and the entire newspaper page of all of those airship stories. So that was awesome. I also, this was cool, I got to go see the Aurora in Aurora. Back in October, back when it was the Aurora Borealis was able to be seen like pretty far south, more than it almost ever is. Sometimes that happens, it's very rare, I guess, but this was a cool opportunity to go see just that purple kind of hue up there. I would go up to the Fort Worth History Center to check out their section on Wise County. That's been very helpful. I would go to the Rome Public Library, which they had a whole binder on their collection of what they called the Aurora Alien, which that's awesome. So there are other areas of research. One thing I will say that's been super helpful and cool is that at the symposium, after the main functions of the day were over, I took a group of people out to Aurora. Some of them are part of different things, but namely Christopher Jordan, a buddy of mine who is the host of Curious Realm, along with Mindy Talkfest, who is now the one of the main people involved with the reborn International UFO Bureau. She inherited Hayden Hughes' old International UFO Bureau files and has started the group up again. And she shared with me all of Hayden Hughes' files on Aurora. And this is the letter that talks about how they're going to threaten to sue them if they come digging to try to exhume the body. And here's a photo of Brawley Oates with his hands and some of these guys out at the cemetery. So there's a whole wealth of knowledge that Hayden Hughes at the time in the 70s was there to document, and now that's going to be available for us to share about as well. I really am glad that we got to do this. There is Lillian Jimenez and myself. They're on the anniversary. I'm going to check out. And Zeno, of course, he's over here, a little bit more well-dressed today. So there is the monument. It's still there for now. I don't know if there are going to be plans to remove that or anything, but unfortunately that big party patio is closed off. It's out of commission. The county has seized it because it's likely that a great deal of money that unfortunately previous city administrator Dr. Tony Wheeler stole was utilized for that project. And there's the well. That's what it looks like today. Not much to see. There's sort of a particle board with like a brick holding some material over it. And there is water down there, but you wouldn't want to try to get in there. There's the location of what would have been like the windmill and the water tank, and then this is where this well would have been. And this is probably the newer remade well, but this gives us an idea about what this area looks like 128 years later, which is amazing to think it's been that long. We also got to go down to the cemetery just down the road, and here are those newer stones. You can see this kind of bald patch where that big stone used to be. People would come and leave a lot of junk and things and say they would regularly clean it off, and they moved it over to the trash cans. But they have a new Cemetery Association sign, and it tells about rules and things, but that's what it looks like now. And I will say it's cool. I got to show that Jim Marrs documentary that I helped him update at a historic theater, and so it's cool to see that we got to do that on the big screen. I am in the process of looking into some historical documents in the Masonic realm with my buddy Tom Morgan. He's the Assistant State Director here in Texas for MUFON and helps with the DFW MUFON group. So we were at the Grand Lodge in Waco looking at any records we could find of Aurora or any of the people mentioned. Because I was told by Dr. Tony Wheeler that the incident was recorded in the Masons' minutes at the time. And if that is true, then we will find out. And we're currently in that process. And the last few things I'll just share on this will just be that the Historical Society has a new location. It's not as grand as the old place, but they have a new place right next to the historic courthouse in downtown Decatur, Texas, which is in Wise County. I got one of their recently published gravestone books, which has pretty much every known grave and person in Wise County, over 100 cemeteries. This is a huge work in progress by this group. And so it's really cool. I'm excited to go through all of that. And one thing I will just say, this is kind of cool because this is literally, I just updated this earlier today. Looking at the families, one of the things I mentioned about names, trying to search historical records, sometimes if you don't type in the name correctly, it'll say there's no results, or it'll skew your results into different directions. The original article mentions Proctor, the Judge J.S., which is James Spencer Proctor. They spelled it Proctor. So when you search that, you'll have limited results because apparently their name was here, Procter, with ER, not OR. And one of the fun, interesting things is that the Proctor family had been around for a while. They were from Kentucky. They moved to Wise County. They lived in Aurora, having this little farm or homestead with the windmill and water tank and all of that. And the flower garden that got destroyed. Well, they have family, and his son, Orion, had already been alive and well, at the time, living there or nearby in Springtown. Orion had a daughter. This would have been Judge J.S. Proctor's granddaughter, who was living at the time, and eventually, interestingly enough, moved down here to the valley. And just yesterday, we went out to the cemetery to go find this grave. As you can see, Eileen Proctor Wilcox was the granddaughter of Judge J.S. Proctor right here in Edinburgh. born in 1896, would have been 1 year old at the time of the incident, or whatever was supposed to have happened, and lived to 1960, but came down here with her family and lived in Edinburgh, or at least in the area was buried in Edinburgh at Hillcrest Memorial Park. So the research continues. It's really interesting to see, like, there are so many different avenues to approach this, not as just an investigative case, but as I like to see it, I am interested in all the ways that this can be approached as fiction, as facts, fiction, or folklore, to be able to preserve the cultural history of the legend. It's not for me, not to be made into a way that I can try to prove to you this happened or disprove. There are already so many people who say this is a hoax and who are adamant that this is nothing more than a tall tale. There's so much information out there that'll say that. And I'm not here to tell you that it's a hoax or not a hoax, but to show that, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many ways that this story has been included in multimedia for decades that I think it's important to show that not only is it one of the most widely publicized stories of an otherworldly encounter ever, but that it helps to inspire our understanding about what's not only possible today, but in the minds of the times when people, we thought, weren't even discussing these ideas or anything to this effect, but now we can see people in government and in our society are talking about recovered objects, not just UFOs in the sky, not just aliens on other worlds, but what is the possibility of them being here interacting with us? What is the possibility that we as people, as groups, as government, in official capacities, what is it to this subject that really entices us? And what is it that could be really going on that we can find out so much about when it deals with what's known behind closed doors, what can be vindicated when it comes to people who describe counts of interactions, all the CE, close encounter scale events. There's so much to it that I think we can learn from stories like this, even if it's approached as folklore. It doesn't have to be real or it doesn't have to be fake. It's just a way for us to learn that there's many ways we can approach research and to understand that the ways in which we learn things, even through documenting and attempting to do what we can to record and preserve information. The losses of material at buildings and museums, that's terribly unfortunate, but it just goes to show we need to do what we can to keep these things intact, and so I'm doing what I am as my research project to preserve this history. So I'm always glad to kind of interact with anyone who has anything they want to share or tell about, or anyone that knows anything about Aurora, its inclusion. And I will just say, Noah has a few copies of this left. You can see this really cool Space Monsters of the Old West book that he has here. The front cover is the burial, and it's great to be able to see that kind of utilized. And I would just say check out, there's so many things out there. I'd be glad to continue the discussion. We've got Noe coming up a little bit later on. Awesome presentation from Lillian as well, and we're going to have the panel to come a little bit later on. So with that, I thank you guys. I'd be glad to continue afterward and stick around. We've got some great stuff coming up next. So thanks, appreciate it.
The Aurora case has always fascinated me, and it's one of the most interesting UFO stories in the state of Texas. Having been there and stood where this space visitor supposedly was buried by the townspeople, having seen the historical marker and gone over to the property that was formerly owned by Judge Proctor, where supposedly the craft crashed. All of that is extremely interesting. If you're ever in that area, it's going to take a little bit of effort, like Daniel said, to find it, but it really is worthwhile.